Volume 2, Chapter 1. Herbert Clarence's History, continued.
I was punctual to the moment with my engagement with the beautiful Helen, and the moment I saw her, I rushed into her arms. I then proceeded to strip her of her clothes, and she did the same office for me. I made her sit, naked as she was, on my knee, and began kissing her body all over, caressing her breasts and sucking the rosy tips surmounting them. I descended to her belly, smoothing it with my hand, and then I attacked the very centre of pleasure, first putting in one finger and then another, and twisting the hair surrounding her mount. I then made her stand with her legs apart, and I kneeled before her and put my tongue into the coral passage, giving her intense pleasure. I seized her clitoris between my lips, at the same time titillating the inside of her con with my finger. I thought she would expire with delight. I stroked down her thighs with my hands. I then made her stoop forward, by which means she exposed her handsome buttocks completely to my gaze. I slapped them with my hand until they were as red as a cherry. This was too much for me, for making her lean with her head on the bed, I had a fine opportunity to enter her from the rear. I was on her in a moment. I felt her warm buttocks rubbing against my belly, while my instrument entered a prodigious way into her body, and I commenced my movements. At every push I made, I could feel my testicles strike against her bottom. My hands, at the same time, were passed round her body. With one hand I handled her breasts, with the other I rubbed the top of her slit. The pleasure was so great that it could not last, and we both actually swooned away when the crisis came, I falling all my length on her back, and she falling on her belly on the bed. A few minutes' repose served to renew our energies. I now placed a large cushion on the bed, and, taking her in my arms, I made her recline against it, in such a way that I could easily enter her body while in a standing position. She passed one arm around my neck, the other around my body, and her two breasts beat against my chest. My instrument was soon buried in her glowing sheath. I pushed vigorously, and her breasts rebounded, quivered with the shock. Even our very hair intermingled. She was beyond herself and could continue her passion no longer, but opening her thighs to the utmost extent she discharged, and I did the same, her pleasures being 100 times increased as she felt the warm liquor rushing into her womb. We soon recovered ourselves. This time I seated myself on the bed and drew her, naked as she was, onto my knees. How delicious was the sensation of her warm bottom to my thighs! She impaled herself on the object of her divinity. She now moved herself rapidly up and down, but I did not let her finish in this manner, but turning her around with her face towards me, I carried her to a sofa and lay panting and heaving on her bosom. She began to wriggle her bottom again, and in a few moments we again dissolved in bliss. The time had now arrived for us to separate, and hurriedly dressing ourselves, we bade an affectionate farewell to each other. I never saw Helen after this, for my uncle died suddenly, leaving me his heir, and Helen was married shortly after, and went south to live. Soon after coming into my uncle's estate, I moved to New York, and took up my residence at the St. Nicholas Hotel, determined to see a little life before settling down as a steady man. I had been at the hotel but a few days when I made the acquaintance of a gentleman about my own age. His name was George Darvill, and he was a first-class fellow. In the course of conversation we struck on subjects of an amorous character, and I soon discovered that my friend was no novice in the field of Venus. That same evening we went together to Niblo's garden, and took our places in the parquet. Just before the curtain rose I stood up from my seat to gaze around the house. My eyes were immediately arrested by a beautiful girl stationed in one of the private boxes. She was the most perfect blonde I had ever seen. Her hair was a glossy auburn, and shaded a face that might have served for the model of Titian's Venus. Her features were regular, her eyes a deep blue shaded by long eyelashes, which gave a dreamy expression to her lovely countenance. Her lips were full and sensuous. A lovely carnation hue, evidently nature's own colouring, adorned her soft velvet cheek. Her neck and shoulders, for she wore a low-necked dress, were as white as Parian marble, and her bust was full and voluptuous. I immediately turned to George and asked him if he knew her.
"Why, that's Harriet Wells,"
said he.
"the most lascivious woman in all New York. She does nothing in the common way, not even the act of sexual intercourse. She is a young girl of immense fortune, and puts no restraint on her passions. But come with me, and I will introduce you to her. I am in favor with her just now, and perhaps we may get an invitation to supper. If we do, I can tell you we will see a scene that you will remember to the longest day of your life."
We immediately proceeded to the box where the beautiful girl was seated. She received us with a charming smile, and I was soon on terms of the closest intimacy with her. After we had conversed for about a quarter of an hour, she whispered something to George, to which he made the reply, "All right." She then turned to me and asked me to sup with her that evening after the play was over. To this invitation I gave a willing assent. The first act of the play was over, and the curtain rose for the second.
"What a dull piece,"
said Harriet.
"Let us retire to the rear of the box, where we shall not be seen by the audience. We can then converse with more freedom. I dare say you don't care about seeing the play, Mr. Clarence?"
"Not at all," I replied. "I would 1,000 times rather converse with you than see the finest play in the world."
"That's a very pretty compliment,"
said she, rising from her chair, and taking up her position at the back of the box, where I followed her. George now excused himself, and said that he would return when the piece was ended, leaving me alone with Harriet. In the position we had taken, no one could see us, neither from the stage nor from the theatre. When we were alone, I put my arms round the lovely girl's waist, and, drawing her towards me, imprinted a moist kiss on her soft, dewy lips, and then begged her pardon for my boldness.
"There is no apology necessary,"
said Harriet.
"I like it as much as you do yourself, and I like men to be bold."
She then kissed me of her own accord, and I could even feel her tongue penetrate my lips, while a deep flush of desire suffused her face. Thus encouraged, I grew more bold, and placed my hand on her white shoulders. I gently let it slide down inside the front of her dress, and it came in contact with her glorious bubbies. Of all the breasts I had ever felt, there were none could be compared with hers, so voluptuous, so white and so firm. I handled them at will, pressing them and pulling down her dress, exposing them to my ardent gaze. Harriet placed one of her feet on a chair, and placed her other leg across my lap. This movement raised her petticoats in such a manner that it showed me a considerable portion of her gloriously formed limbs. In a moment my hand was under her clothes, handling at will her lovely con. She stretched her thighs widely to assist me in my researches. Nay, more, she raised her petticoats with her own hand, and exposed to my delighted gaze the lovely domain of Venus. I frantically seized the beautiful girl, and stretching her length upon a settee, I strode over her, and forcing my head between her thighs, I kissed her mount over and over, while she nestled my rod between her breasts. I sought out her clitoris, which I easily found, for it was extremely largely developed, and began to titillate it with my tongue.
"Stop!"
cried Harriet, a convulsive shudder running through her system.
"You must reserve yourself for tonight."
I now desisted, and we contented ourselves with feeling and touching only, until the piece was ended. Just before the conclusion of the play, Harriet sent a note to the green room, and informed me that she had invited 2 well-known actresses to sup with us. They were both beautiful girls, but more of them by and by. As we were leaving the theatre, George and the 2 actresses who had been invited found us, and we all proceeded to Harriet's house in her carriage. Miss Wells resided in a magnificent mansion on Fifth Avenue. When we entered, I was struck with the elegance seen everywhere. The drawing-room especially claimed my attention. A delicious perfume was distilled in the atmosphere, and the brilliant gas-burners shed an effusion of light throughout the apartment. The most elegant furniture was spread through the chamber, consisting of canopies, sofas, and chairs of the most costly description. On the floor was spread a carpet so soft that the sound of footsteps was inaudible. The walls were a mass of mirrors extending from the ceiling to the floor, relieved here and there by magnificent paintings, representing woman's form in every attitude and every variety of costume. In fact, the most beautiful women could be seen, from those most simply clad to those without a particle of clothing to cover their nakedness. I was transported with the scene. I felt my blood boil in my veins with undefined desires. We all five sat down to a magnificent supper, and partook plentifully of champagne. The three girls looked beautiful in the evening costumes. They were all very lightly clad, revealing a considerable portion of their womanly charms. Their dresses were cut very low in the neck, revealing almost the whole of their lovely breasts. Their dresses, too, were of the thinnest description, and allowed their voluptuous limbs to be distinctly traced through them. One of the actresses was named Ernestine, a beautiful girl of about 20. The other was named Isabel, and was a year or two younger. After supper we entered a delicious boudoir, evidently fitted up purposely for performing the rites of Venus. We had no sooner entered the chamber than Harriet exclaimed,
"Come, ladies and gentlemen, you all know what we have come here for. Let's have no reserve."
So saying, she deliberately pulled up her skirts above her navel, and seating herself on the ground, stretched her thighs open to the widest extent, giving us a full view of her hidden charms. She then pulled me to her, and unbuttoning my trousers, released my staff and began to kiss and embrace it, titillating the head of it with her tongue. Nor was this all. Ernestine also raised up her skirts and showed us her magnificently formed thighs and mons veneris, and putting her arms round my neck, kissed me passionately. Isabel sat down before George, and shaking her dress off from her shoulders, she nestled his staff between her lovely bubbies. Her petticoats, too, were elevated, so that we could see all the lower portion of her naked body. I glanced in the mirrors around the room, and beheld a glorious scene. First of all, there was the beautiful Harriet, with her milk-white thighs stretched widely apart, and her pouting bijou covered with its downy moss, staring me right in the face. Then there was the charming Ernestine, with her luscious con rubbing against my thigh, while Isabel showed me her white buttocks, with the lips of her slit peeping between the posterior portion of her splendid thighs. Of course, the sight of these beauties fired my blood in such a manner that I was completely beside myself, and if Harriet had continued her titillations with her tongue a minute more, I must have emitted in her mouth. But she suddenly stopped.
"Let us all strip,"
she exclaimed.
"Our clothes are only in our way."
We all seconded her motion, and in a few moments we were all as naked as we were born. Ye gods, what a glorious sight it was for me! Just imagine 3 beautiful women entirely naked before my eyes. Thighs, breasts, bellies, bottoms, cons, all merited my admiration, and deserved my embraces. I paid my devoir to all 3 without any distinction. Now it was Harriet's beautiful bubbies, now Ernestine's lovely bottom, and now Isabel's glorious slit. I kissed them all over, not even omitting their lovely mounts of Venus. Indeed, I can say with truth that before 3 minutes elapsed I had explored all 3 of their vaginas with my tongue. Nor had they been passive spectators the while, for they paid back with interest on my person all that I did to them. They sucked my pego, they titillated my testicles, they forced their fingers into the trou de mon cul. Ernestine breathed on my belly, while Isabel slapped my buttocks. George went through exactly the same thing. The consequence was, we were all inflamed to the highest degree. When Harriet thought we were all sufficiently excited, she raised her finger as a token for us to cease, and exclaimed,
"I proclaim myself the priestess of this assembly, and shall take upon myself the ordering of all tableaux. First of all, I give as your motto, voluptuousness, lasciviousness, and sexual enjoyment. There must be no modesty, no shamefacedness, and everybody must obey the slightest of my commands, let them be ever so outré. I shall make use of the common words when referring to the organs of generation, and shall expect everyone else to do the same."
I shall still continue to use the French words, but you must understand that whenever I do so, the English common words were used by Harriet and her companions.
"And now to begin,"
continued Harriet.
"Fond as I am of being embraced by a man, I like almost equally well to receive the embraces of my own sex, and still more to see others performing the desired act of copulation.
She now sat down on a low sofa and stretched her thighs widely apart.
My first order is that Ernestine shall kneel before me and fet my con with her delicious tongue, and that, while she is thus engaged, Mr. Clarence shall embrace her from behind, while George shall satisfy Isabel's pouting slit with his magnificent staff, so close to me that I can feel them both when in the act.
We immediately began to work in the manner prescribed to us. Ernestine knelt down and fastened her head between Harriet's lovely thighs, and separating the lips of the latter's con with her finger and thumb, she plunged her tongue into the coral cavity. The position Ernestine assumed caused her splendid bottom to be elevated in the air, and between the cheeks of her buttocks I could plainly discern the luscious lips of her con. In a moment I was behind, and, pointing my staff, it was quickly embedded in her warm vagina, the lips of her sheath clasping it like a glove. George took Isabel and placed her sitting on the sofa beside Harriet. The lovely girl raised her thighs in the air. George rushed between them, and his instrument pierced her to the quick. Harriet clapped her hand as a signal that we were to commence, and we all began to push for the very life. Harriet, by means of the mirror, had the whole voluptuous scene before her eyes. While she felt Ernestine's tongue in her salacious slit, she could see my instrument enter in and out of the latter's con, and saw also George's rod appear and disappear in Isabel's beautiful body. Now more, while the two latter were thus engaged, our priestess stretched out her hand, placed it underneath Isabel's thighs, and titillated their sexual organs, while in the act of coition. Sometimes it would be the lovely girl's clitoris, another time it would be her bottom, and another George's pendants, which she gently squeezed. These touches had the effect of causing those two to go before we did. I suddenly saw Isabel's eyelids tremble. She raised her white thighs high in the air, while a convulsive shudder of delight ran through her whole body. George's strokes now became faster and more furious. His buttocks quivered, and he fell palpitating on his companion's belly, while a low cry from her announced that he had sent his fiery metal up to her very womb, meeting her own emission on the way. About a minute afterwards I felt Ernestine's vagina embrace my penis tightly. A convulsive trembling seized her bottom, and she wiggled herself from side to side on my staff. In another moment I had inundated her with my sperm, while she discharged so copiously that it trickled down the inside of her beautiful thighs.
I too come,
said Harriet, seeing that we were all hors de combat, and she elevated her buttocks, and pressing her mount tightly to Ernestine's face, found relief in a shower of love's dew, and then sank back exhausted on the sofa. In a minute or two we all rose, washed ourselves, and were ready for another bout.
Seat yourself on the sofa, Mr. Clarence,
said Harriet. I obeyed. She came and sat on my lap, and guided my stiff dart into the innermost recesses of her con. She then leaned forward, and making George sit on the other end of the sofa, she took his staff between her magnificent breasts, and squeezing them close together, held it a tight prisoner there. She now made Isabel take her place by my side, and Ernestine sat next to George. She then ordered us to place our hands on each of their cons. We obeyed. Harriet had one of the most delicious bijoux in the world. It was so tight and warm that it embraced my pego very closely. I forced the middle finger of my right hand into Isabel's coral passage, while I titillated her clitoris with my thumb. With my other hand I tickled Harriet's bottom. George did the same for Ernestine, and we all moved together. I noticed that while George's staff was moving between her two bubbies, she frequently bent forward and titillated the ruby head of his rod with her tongue. All at once I saw the white semen gush from his engine all over her white breasts, at the same moment that I shot my charge into Harriet's vagina and received Isabel's emission on my hand. Ernestine, too, almost at the same moment, bedewed George's fingers. This last engagement seemed rather to increase our sexual desires rather than to quench them. Acting according to the orders of our priestess, I sat myself on a chair before a large mirror. Isabel came and straddled my thighs, and Ernestine guided my engine into Isabel's lovely grotto. I cast my eyes in the glass and had a splendid front view of my companion's thighs, notch, etc. I could see my staff embedded in her vagina, and had a distinct view of the luscious lips embracing it. The lovely girl was delighted to be so thoroughly gorged. Ernestine laid on her back exactly in front of us, and Harriet knelt down before her, and with her tongue titillated her clitoris, while George entered Harriet from behind. It was a magnificent sight to us, and we all soon emitted. We now partook of some spiced wine, which had the effect of entirely restoring our energies, and our rampant instruments proved that we were quite ready for another engagement in the courts of Venus. Harriet now ordered me to lie on my back on the floor, and pushed Ernestine on the top of me. My pego entered her con. Harriet began to tickle our genitals when we were thus joined, while George entered her en cul, at the same time passing his hand in front of her, and titillating her clitoris with his finger. With her unoccupied hand, Harriet took possession of Isabel's con, and forced 2 fingers in it, and in this manner we all again succumbed. I should tire you if I were to enumerate all the manners and modes in which we accomplished the sexual act. Suffice it to say that we kept it up until 5 o'clock the next morning, and only ceased from sheer inability to proceed further. During that time I had embraced 3 girls in every part of their bodies, en con, en cul, between the bubbies, the buttocks, and, in short, every portion of their bodies. I took a week's rest after this night's experience. My history is already too long, but I have one more adventure to describe, and then I have done. About a month after my adventure with Harriet Wells, I received a note from an aunt of mine who kept a ladies' seminary in Westchester County, New York, asking me to come and spend a month with her. Having no particular business to attend to, I determined to accept this invitation, thinking perhaps I might meet with some adventures among so many young girls. Beside which I knew that my aunt had a very pretty daughter, and I thought perhaps she and I might become better acquainted. In a few hours I was at my aunt's door, and was received with the utmost cordiality by my aunt. I had scarcely entered the drawing-room before my cousin Emmeline made her appearance. The moment I cast my eyes upon her, I was almost struck dumb with surprise, for she was so much more beautiful than I had expected to find her. It was at least 10 years since I had seen her. She was at that time 12 years old, and promised to be very pretty, but I never expected to see such an embodiment of female loveliness as now appeared. My cousin Emmeline was 22 years of age. She was tall, stately, and voluptuously formed. Her face was perfectly oval, and her features were regular almost to a fault. Her hair, which was very abundant, was a dark glossy brown, and fell in massive bands on a neck as white and pure as alabaster. Her eyes were dark and flashing, and shrouded with long eyelashes, while her figure was perfect. She was dressed en négligé, but through her morning wrapper I could trace the round form of her voluptuous bust. She received me with the utmost frankness, and made no objection to the kiss that I imprinted on her ruby lips, with a cousin's liberty. During her temporary absence from the room, her mother informed me that she was to be married in 3 weeks to a very rich gentleman, who was a good deal older than herself, and for whom she did not profess any deep attachment. In the afternoon I was ushered into the schoolroom, and found myself surrounded by 30 or 40 beautiful girls of all ages and styles of loveliness. Some of them were excessively beautiful, and all cast on me curious glances, as if they wondered what my business could be there. In the evening my aunt, cousin, and myself met in the drawing-room, and the evening was passed with music, singing, and conversation. If Emmeline looked beautiful in a morning costume, she was perfectly lovely in evening dress. She wore her frock cut so low in the neck that the contours of her lovely bust could be plainly seen. In fact, while she was performing on the piano, I bent over her for the purpose of turning the leaves of her music, and as she bent forward I had a most distinct view of the 2 white semi-globes of her bosom. They were separated by a white valley which led to other hidden charms. The sight of her delicious bubbies so excited me that I was compelled to hold my pocket handkerchief in front of me to hide the protuberance produced by her charms. Several days passed, during which time I attempted to take several liberties with my cousin, but she always stopped me at a certain point, no doubt actuated by the fact of her approaching marriage. I was in despair, for I saw no way of accomplishing my designs. The thought struck me, however, that if I could only succeed in exciting her passions, I might move her to my will. I determined to make my attempt. I had in my stock amorous books, one in French, entitled L'Académie des Dames, an exceedingly lascivious work, interspersed with the most magnificent engravings. It was something like Aretino's favourite Putanti Errante, but much more full and complete. It purported to be a dialogue between two young girls, and gave the fullest information in all sexual matters, interspersed with vivid and glowing descriptions of the sexual act. This book I stealthily lay in my cousin's way, as if I had left it there by accident. I rejoiced to find, half an hour afterwards, on returning to the place where I had put it, that it was gone, and I had no doubt but that it had fallen into Emmeline's hands. The house in which my aunt resided was an old-fashioned building, containing very large rooms, all communicating with each other. The bedroom allotted to me was situated next to Emmeline's chamber, and there was a communication between the two apartments by means of a closet, which served for both rooms. This closet was only divided by a green curtain. I retired to bed very early that night, and the first thing I did was to cut a hole in the curtain and leave my side of the closet door open. I then put out my light and waited for events. I had not to wait long, for I soon heard Emmeline's light step ascending the stairs. I had only just taken my position in the closet when she entered the chamber. As luck would have it, she did not close her closet door, but immediately began to undress. Great God! What beauties she revealed to me as she removed her garments, one by one. First it was her beautiful shoulders, next her voluptuous limbs, and lastly her resplendent bosom, for when she stood in her chemise I had a full view of her naked bubbies. No words that I can utter can give the faintest idea of the glories of their form and beauty. They were beyond comparison. She now went to her trunk, and took from it a book, which I discovered in a moment to be L'Académie des Dames, and then she threw herself, lightly clad as she was, upon the bed. Her couch was placed exactly opposite my hiding-place, so that I had a most perfect view of her as she reclined there. One of her milk-white breasts was entirely bare, and her chemise was raised sufficiently high for me to see a portion of her lovely thighs. She began to read, and soon I saw a strange change take place in her. Her face grew flushed, her bosom heaved, and she began to twist her legs and thighs about in a curious manner. Suddenly, without any previous intimation of her intention, she seized the lower end of her chemise and slowly raised it above her navel. By this action all her hidden charms were entirely exposed to me. Heavens! I glanced on the picture. Imagination cannot paint the delicious sight that met my eyes. Her con was one of the loveliest I had ever beheld. I could distinctly trace the two pouting lips through a forest of umbrageous covering, while her white belly, her delicious thighs, and voluptuous breast formed the adjuncts to a picture which I feel it is in vain for me to attempt to describe. The lovely Emmeline still continued reading, little suspecting that prying eyes were eagerly devouring her most secret charms. She held the book in her left hand. Her right fell carelessly by her side, her fingers coming in contact with the hair surrounding her mons veneris. A shiver ran through her system when she felt the place on which her hand had fallen, and she instinctively raised up her thighs to admit more easily her researches into her own beauties. The book had evidently grown now quite interesting, for I saw the middle finger of her hand slowly separate the pouting lips of her bijou to find a refuge in her warm vagina. She now began to move it in and out, slowly at first. It appeared to fit very tightly, for every onward motion brought out the myphi, and they disappeared again when the deflowering finger advanced inwards. These titillations were more than the lovely girl could bear, for she threw away the book and set earnestly about giving herself relief. Her fingers now moved with lightning rapidity in and out of her vagina, while with her thumb she titillated her clitoris. By heavens, she's about to come! I can read it in the voluptuous motions of her charming body. I can read it in the frantic motion of her finger and in the twitching of her eyelids. There, dear girl, now it flows, there, there. The acme was reached, and she fainted away. I was so excited by what I had seen that, regardless of consequences, I rushed into my cousin's bedchamber. She did not hear me, for she had not yet recovered her consciousness. I pulled out my pocket handkerchief and wiped her lovely bijou perfectly dry. I then knelt down by the side of the bed and tenderly kissed the theatre of her pleasures. The warmth of my embrace doubtless recalled her to herself, for she opened her eyes and gazed on me. The moment she saw me, she uttered a faint scream. "Hush, dear Emmeline," I exclaimed. "It is I, your cousin Herbert. After what I have seen, all further reserve would be folly. I love you, my dear cousin, and must enjoy your beautiful body. No one need know anything about it."
Promise to conceal what you have seen this night, and you may do anything you please with me,
she replied. "I swear it," I answered. The beautiful girl no sooner heard me utter these words than she threw her arms round my neck and kissed me passionately. I twined her beautiful limbs in mine and rolled her over on the bed. I now laid on my back, and turning her magnificent buttocks towards my face, she guided my lance into her ruby cavity. A slight upward motion on my part caused it to enter completely, and I had the gratification of seeing my instrument enter in and out of her coral crevice during the act of coition. Emmeline, when she felt my proud engine pierce her vitals, was almost delirious with joy. She knelt with my thighs between hers, and in the delirium of pleasure convulsively grasped the bedclothes. I felt that I was about to emit, and finding that she was not quite ready to come, I passed a hand round her hips, and titillated her clitoris with my finger. This had the effect of immediately bringing down her emission. We both discharged together. I have already, my dear girls, made my history too long, or I could detain you for hours yet with an account of the various modes in which I enjoyed my cousin. I could also tell you how I overcame the virtue of 5 of my aunt's eldest scholars, and how one night we all enjoyed an orgy in my cousin Emmeline's chamber. But in such a relation I should necessarily have to repeat scenes I have already depicted, so I forbear. My cousin Emmeline was married on the day appointed. I returned home, became acquainted with my present wife, and was married. Some little time after my marriage I managed to get Amy to accept my embraces. I shall leave the details for her to tell.
Amy blushed and would fain have been excused, but we both insisted. Amy was not obdurate, and could not withstand our entreaties. She commenced her history in the terms which will be found in the next chapter. End of Volume 2, Chapter 1. The Life and Amours of Kate Percival, written by herself. Volume 2, Chapter 2. Amy Denmead's History.
I was born in Philadelphia. My father was a large and successful merchant, doing business there. We lived in a large house in the upper part of Chestnut Street, and my father's wealth procured me every luxury that the heart could wish for. I never knew my mother, for she died when I was quite young. My sister was married to you, Herbert, when I was 17 years of age. My ideas up to that time were very vague regarding the sexes, but I was soon destined to be fully enlightened. I felt very dull after my sister had gone away, and my father proposed that I should write and ask my old schoolfellow, Florence Maltby, to come and stay on a visit with us. I cordially agreed to this proposition, for I loved Florence, and had not seen her for several years, although we kept up a constant correspondence. Florence accepted my invitation, and on the day agreed upon she took up her abode with us. Miss Maltby was a beautiful girl, about 20 years of age. Her hair and eyes were black, In fact, she was a decided brunette. She was fiery, impulsive, and amorous. We had 1,000 things to converse about, and in a few hours all our old friendship was reknit, and we became more intimate than ever. Of course we slept together. For 2 or 3 nights nothing occurred of special moment. I noticed, however, that Florence would kiss me with a great deal of warmth, and press me tenderly in her arms when we were in bed together, but I thought nothing of it. One night, about a week after she had been an inmate of our house, when we retired to our chamber, instead of undressing as usual, Florence seated herself on the side of the bed and watched me in the process of disrobing. I had unhooked the front of my dress, and it had fallen on my shoulders, and my chemise, being open in the front, allowed my 2 breasts to be seen. Nay, even a portion of the white plain below was visible. Florence no sooner saw this than her eyes brightened, and she ran up to me and began to mould my boobies. Although this action somewhat surprised me, I made no resistance, and to tell the truth, the contact of her soft hands on my breasts was very agreeable.
"What delicious breasts you have!"
said Florence.
"How well formed they are, and yet how large! See how stiff the rosy nipples stand out from this field of snow. Oh, how I would love to kiss and press them!
And she buried her head between the 2 semi-globes.
And then your belly, how soft and white it is!"
she continued, passing her hand over it.
"How happy will the man be who presses that belly to his own!"
"Oh, fie, Florence, you should not talk in that manner," I replied, my face flushing with the fire kindled in me by her lascivious touchings. "But you exaggerate my beauties. It is true my breasts are a little larger than yours, but they are not one bit more handsome, more firm, nor more elastic. Come, dear, let us compare them, for I do not see why I should not be gratified as well as yourself." I now unhooked Florence's dress and pulled it down to her waist. Her 2 semi-globes were completely exposed. They were beautifully formed, firm, elastic, and standing boldly out from her chest. I pressed and caressed them, sucking the rosy nipples which stood out stiff with desire.
"You naughty girl,"
said Florence.
"You will devour me. Your kisses send a fire through my veins, and these delicious globes, too."
"Could it be possible to see prettier boobies than these?" I interrupted. "Just see how stiff the nipples are, and then you talk of my belly. Look at yours. How deliciously smooth, how beautifully white."
"Come, darling,"
said Florence.
"let us rub breasts together. I'm sure it will give us mutual delight."
"I will do anything you wish, Florence, for I feel a strange fire burning in me. Come, love, come." We pulled down our clothes as low as possible, so as to leave us a clear field. We then brought our chests together in such a way that our breasts rubbed against each other. To show how amorous we were, I need only say that this strange action gave us great delight.
"Is it not exquisite?"
said Florence.
"The sensations of your breast against mine fires my whole blood."
"I experience the same feelings," I returned. "Oh, it is charming."
"Amy,"
said Florence after a few minutes' repose.
"do you know what I would like to do?"
"No, what?"
"I should like to explore your more secret beauties."
"With all my heart," I replied, "if you will allow me the same privilege."
"Willingly. I should love it,"
returned Florence. "Come then, darling," I exclaimed. "I am ready. Do with me as you like."
"Dear girl, how good you are,"
returned Florence.
"Lie down with your belly on the bed, that I may admire and manipulate your beauties. That's right, darling."
I threw myself on my face on the bed. Florence came behind me and, lifting up my petticoats, exposed my bottom to her gaze. Of course, she saw also the pouting lips of my Bayou at the bottom of the fleshy cushions, faintly overshadowed with hair. She moved my thighs slightly apart, by which movements the lips of my sheath were slightly separated, revealing a line of coral between them. Florence absolutely threw herself on my bottom and devoured it with the most lascivious and ardent kisses. "Does that position suit you, dear Florence?" said I, with my face buried in the bed.
"It is charming, delicious,"
said Florence, moulding and pressing my buttocks.
Great heavens! Amy, how the sight of your beauties fires me! What magnificent buttocks! How white and firm, how well developed!
And again she bent down and smothered them with kisses.
I should never be tired kissing your lovely bottom,
she continued.
And the edges of that dear little cleft I see between your thighs. How inviting it looks! How beautiful it is, shaded with silky down! Oh, I must!
And she put her finger between the lips of my sheath and titillated my vagina.
How charming! How delicious!
she repeated.
Amy, I am in a blaze. My slit is on fire. How deliciously tight your vagina clasps my finger, and what a delightful warmth is there. There! Now I have your clitoris. How stiff it is!
Dearest Florence, I exclaimed, wiggling my buttocks, for the in and out motion of her finger was more than I could bear. Your touchings and titillations are bringing on a crisis. Stay the motion of your finger, or I shall come. There it is. Oh, I die. During this last speech of mine I moved my buttocks up and down, imitating the conjugal act, Florence all the time continuing her manipulations until the crisis came and I fell motionless on my belly.
Come, Amy,
said Florence, withdrawing her dripping finger from my sheath.
For heaven's sake, give me relief, or I die.
I rose from my recumbent posture, and seizing Florence by the waist, pushed her on the bed. She fell on her back. I threw her petticoats over her head. This action revealed all the lower portion of Florence's body, and a beautiful sight it was. 2 magnificently developed thighs led up to a charming grotto covered with black hair, between the pouting lips of which could be seen her clitoris. Stiff with intense desire, I admired for a moment Florence's beauties, and then commenced my manipulations. First of all, I stroked her belly, implanting kiss after kiss upon it. I then played with the hair covering her mons veneris, twisting my finger in and out of it. I then divided the lips of her sheath, and titillated her highly excited clitoris. Great heavens, Florence, I exclaimed, what a beautiful bayou yours is! What delicious pouting lips! What a forest of black hair! And then your clitoris, how finely developed! Let me kiss it. Let me suck it. I now stooped down and inserted my tongue between the lips of Florence's ruby passage, and titillated her clitoris with the tip of it. Great God, how delicious! I exclaimed. I feel ready to come again. I do indeed, darling.
Amy, darling, keep on,
said Florence, almost crazy with delight.
Pass one hand behind and press my buttocks.
I did as she desired, and advanced one finger in the narrow canal adjacent to the legitimate road, and kept time with my tongue and finger.
There, that's it,
she continued.
I am coming. Oh, now, there.
She opened her thighs to the widest extent, and lifted her legs high in the air. A convulsive shudder ran through her frame, and she discharged profusely, appearing to be perfectly annihilated by the deliciousness of her sensations. I threw myself by her side on the bed. After a long pause, we both rose and kissed each other tenderly. Such was my first initiation in the sports of Venus. Florence remained with us some months, and scarcely a day passed that we did not enjoy the pleasures of the gods. When she left us, I was for a time disconsolate, but soon after I received an invitation to visit Herbert and my sister. He has left it to me, dear Kate, to give the history of my first amour with him. I shall do so, freely speaking, as if he were not present. I was received with the utmost kindness by my brother-in-law, and truth compels me to state, rogue that he has always treated me with the most unvarying affection. At the time of my visit, my sister was very sick, and I really pitied poor Herbert that he was debarred from those sexual enjoyments of which I felt assured he was so fond. But the thought of taking her place never for a moment entered my mind. Herbert was very polite to me, and time passed very agreeably. One day I stumbled in an obscure corner of the library on some amorous books. I secured them, and conveyed them to my chamber. I then examined them, and found that they contained pictures of a very lascivious character. In fact, men and women, as naked as they were born, were performing the sexual act. I read them with avidity, and they soon made me adept in sexual knowledge. One evening, when Herbert had gone to Philadelphia, and my sister was confined to her chamber by sickness, I entered the drawing-room with one of those prizes in my hand, determined to enjoy it all myself. I was in a state of delicious languor, and, throwing myself carelessly on the sofa, began to read my book. I wore a low-necked dress, and the weather being warm, I had unfastened 2 or 3 of the top loops, thus leaving a considerable portion of my breasts exposed. My dress, too, was disarranged at my feet, revealing a considerable portion of my limbs. As I read, my cheeks became flushed, my bosom heaved, and I was altogether in a state propitious for an attack. I was suddenly startled by the sound of a voice at my elbow.
What is the name of that book which seems to engross so much of your attention?
Said the voice. I raised my eyes, and who should I see but Herbert himself, gazing on me with heightened colour and burning eyes. "It is too bad, Herbert," I replied, raising from my seat, revealing by this moment a considerable portion of my legs. Nay, I believe he even caught a glimpse of my thighs. "You ought not to come so stealthily into the room,"
My dear girl, you are wrong.
replied Herbert.
I did not come here stealthily, but it was your preoccupation which prevented you from hearing me enter. But you have not yet replied to my question. What book are you reading?
"Oh, it is a stupid work I found in the library. I have only just glanced at it, and do not find it worth reading."
Will you allow me to judge for myself, my charming sister-in-law?
he replied, taking a seat by my side. "No, Herbert, I will not allow it," I returned, pressing the book to my bosom.
I insist.
he cried, endeavouring to snatch the work from my hands. In the struggle his hand came in contact with my bosom, and he even touched the strawberry nipples surmounting the semi-globes. At last he conquered, and obtained possession of the book. I looked imploringly at him, but he opened it deliberately and read the title. It was "The Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure,"
So, Amy,
said he.
this is the subject of your studies, is it?
"I assure you I have not read a page of it. It appears to me foolish and uninteresting, and I was just about to return it to the library when you entered." He knew that I did not tell the truth, for I blushed and cast my eyes down on the ground. He no longer hesitated, but throwing his arms around me, pressed his lips to mine and kissed me ardently. I was astonished and confounded, and endeavoured to escape him, but he held me tight and pressed his breast to mine. "Herbert, Herbert, this is wrong. Let me go, I beg of you," he replied by pressing another kiss on my lips. It was in vain I struggled. He appeared to be endowed with the strength of Hercules. "Do have done," I murmured between each embrace. "Someone might come."
My love, there is no cause for fear. There is no one in the house but you and I. Your sister is confined to her chamber by sickness, and I have given positive orders that I am not at home to anyone. We are absolutely alone."
I could not disguise the pleasure that this news gave me, for my whole body became agitated with the warmth of his embraces, and my bosom palpitated against his. I even dared to return his caresses, and reimbursed with interest the kisses he gave me.
"Amy, I love and adore you,"
said he. "Herbert, I love you, I love you," was the only reply that I could make. Again he pressed his lips to mine, and sucked in my breath. He even inserted the end of his tongue in my mouth, and he met mine, which was as ardent as his own. I believe I should have died if nature had not given me relief at that moment. I believe the same thing happened to him, for he threw himself upon me, and 2 or 3 convulsive shudders ran through his system. He then became calmer, and reclined negligently in my arms.
"My beloved, this is true happiness,"
said he.
"Oh, that we could remain thus forever, and that we might never part again.
After a few moments' repose he rose up, and, leaning over me, seized one of my hands and felt my boobies with his unoccupied hand. The contact renewed the fire in his body, and his eyes reassumed their brilliance. When I felt his hand descend upon my breast, I shivered and made a pretense of snatching it away, but it was in vain. He cautiously unhooked my dress. I no longer restrained him. My frock fell off my shoulders, and my naked bust was entirely exposed to his view. He passed from one to the other of my ivory globes, as he called them, and moulded them with his hands, playing with the nipples and applying his lips to them, so that he almost sucked my life away. But he was not yet satisfied. He knelt down before me, and, placing his head between my boobies, began to play with my feet. I made but little resistance, and he began to raise my petticoats. He touched my legs, he reached my knees, and at last his hand came in contact with my fleshy thighs. He rested here a moment, and excited me by kisses. I trembled in his grasp like a leaf. My desires overcame me, and I was completely in his power. He then became more bold, and his agitated hand ascended the marble columns which would lead us to the centre of love. At last he reached my bayou, and ran his fingers in the down covering that mossy spot. He even forced one more bold than the rest, between the lips, and gently rubbed my clitoris. It was too much for me. I opened my thighs to the widest capacity, and absolutely cried with pleasure. He then raised his head from my palpitating bosom, and applied his lips where he had just put his hand. He kissed my mons veneris 1,000 times, and inserted his tongue between the folding lips. He again sought out my clitoris and played with it at will. But this could not continue long. I was absolutely drunk with delirious joy. "Oh, what pleasure!" I cried. "Do what you will with me, my dear Herbert." His only reply was to divest himself of his clothes. He then performed the same office for me, and we were both naked as we were born. He turned me round and round. He patted my buttocks and caressed my body all over. My hands, too, were not idle. I seized his magnificent instrument, and gently rubbed it and tickled his purse. We were both almost crazy. He then reclined me on the back of the sofa, and threw himself on the top of me. I eagerly opened my thighs to receive him, and guided his fiery dart to the entrance of my con. He entered the lips, and met a little resistance, but was not to be conquered, for raising my buttocks I gave a sudden heave upwards, and his instrument was suddenly embedded in the sheath destined by nature to receive it. Then commenced the delicious movements. The motion was delightful. I looked around me and saw our naked bodies reflected in the mirrors. I could see his instrument entering in and out of my coral sheath. At last the consummation came. "Oh, Herbert," I cried, "I die, I die! Closer, closer! Oh!" Thus muttering, I closed my eyes. My eyelids trembled, and with a convulsive movement I threw my legs around his loins, and pressed him so tightly that I almost took away his breath. All was over, for I felt the essence of love rush into my thirsty womb, while I at the same moment poured down my share of Venus's libations. My hold relaxed, and we both fell all our lengths on the couch. After remaining without motion a few minutes, he kissed me again, for he was not yet satisfied. He soon rekindled my desires. He rose from the couch, and raising me up, placed me on its edge, and again commenced his labour of love. With one hand he raised one of my arms in the air, in such a manner as to leave my bosom entirely at his discretion. He took one of the nipples in his mouth, and pressed me to him with his other hand. My thighs were widely separated, and he had no difficulty in entering my vagina. He slightly bent his knees, and was soon buried in my grotto. How delicious was the sensation of his lovely engine rubbing against the sides of my vagina! I assisted him by every means in my power, and in a short time we were again inundated with our mutual emission. Such, my dear Kate, was the manner in which I first became carnally acquainted with Herbert. How many times we have enjoyed each other since, I need not tell you. But this I do assure you, no other man has enjoyed me but Herbert, and as long as he is kind to me, no other shall. My history is ended.
We thanked the charming girl for her confession. It was now getting daylight, and almost time for us to separate. During Amy's recital we had partaken freely of spiced wine, and all of us felt almost as vigorous as ever. We decided we would not separate until we could enter the lists of love no more. Herbert brought a new auxiliary to our pleasures in the field, for going to a cupboard he took from it an india-rubber dildo which he strapped round Amy's waist. And placing me on my side on the couch, he made Amy insert the dildo into my vagina, while she put her finger on my clitoris and began to rub it, at the same time moving her buttocks as if she were a man. He then went behind me and entered me en cool. Amy acted her part splendidly. Herbert passed his hand over her bottom and inserted his finger in her sheath. Both Herbert and Amy moved together, and I had the delicious pleasure of enjoying a double embrace. Herbert's finger, too, was active, and we all discharged simultaneously. After we had recovered, we danced naked about the room. Herbert kissed our breasts, bottoms, and mounts. He placed his staff between our bubbies, he tickled our clitorises, and committed 1,000 other follies. At last he lay down on the couch and pulled Amy on the top of him. She guided his instrument into her coral sheath, and moved herself rapidly up and down, while I clapped her broad white bottom with my hand until they were cherry red. And while I was thus engaged, Herbert's toe entered my slit, and in this manner we all again discharged. It would tire the reader to tell all the ways we adopted to arrive at the same result. Herbert embraced us en con, en cool, between the bubbies, between the buttocks, in fact, in every possible mode, and we did not separate until we were thoroughly exhausted, and until the morning sun was several hours in the heavens. End of Volume 2, Chapter 2. The Life and Amours of Kate Percival, written by herself. Volume 2, Chapter 3. A Change of Fortune. The very next day following our orgy, I received a letter from my father's lawyer, informing me of the death of my only surviving parent, at the same time informing me that he had left all his property to be divided equally between my brother and myself. His wealth was large, for his habits had been penurious, and I found myself the possessor of at least $10,000 a year. This, of course, entirely altered my prospects in life, and it was natural that I should immediately throw up my engagement as governess, and return home for the purpose of assisting the settlement of my father's affairs. I bade an affectionate farewell to Herbert and Amy, and even shed tears at parting with them. In due time I reached home. How still and quiet the place seemed! My brother was abroad, so that everything connected with the property was left to me. I worked energetically, and soon produced something like order. I had been home about a week when I received another letter from my father's lawyer, who resided in New York, stating that my presence was absolutely required in that city to sign certain documents relative to my father's property, and advising me to come at once. I did not hesitate to obey his wishes, and that same evening entered the cars for New York. It was about 6 o'clock when we started, and I took a seat in the rear end of the car. For some miles I was alone, but a young gentleman of about 18 got into the car from a way station and sat down by my side. I could see by the dim light that he was very polite, and we had quite an agreeable conversation together. By and by it grew quite dark, for the lamp stationed in the middle of the car threw very little light where we sat. Our conversation grew more confidential, I may even say affectionate. The young gentleman grew somewhat bold, and, taking my hand, pressed it in his. The novelty of the situation, and the fact that for 10 days I had tasted no sexual pleasure, rendered me oblivious to all resemblance of modesty, and I allowed him to do as he pleased. Nay, I even encouraged him, for I allowed my hand to fall, as if by accident, on a certain protuberance in front of his pantaloons. I had no sooner touched this sensitive spot than a shiver ran through him, and he immediately retained my hand there as a prisoner. All reserve now left him. He had spread a shawl over our knees, so that our actions could not be seen by the other passengers. I suddenly felt the rogue dragging up my skirts and petticoats, and in a few moments his hand was on my naked thigh. He glided over it, and his fingers came into contact with the hair covering my mons veneris. He had already divided the lips of my coral cavity with his digits, and was advancing one in the very center of my vagina when the train entered Philadelphia. Of course this put a stop to his progress, and we were compelled to assume a decent position. He was very attentive to me on the boat when we crossed the Delaware, but he had no opportunity to renew his enterprises. At last we were safely seated in one of the Camden and Amboy railroad cars. As luck would have it, the car was very empty, there not being more than 2 other persons in it besides ourselves. We took our places as far from them as we could. The young gentleman turned the seats, so that he now sat opposite to me. The train had not left the station 100 yards before he commenced operations by making me rest my 2 feet in his seat, one on each side of him, so that he sat between my thighs. He now raised my petticoats and amused himself by feeling my thighs, bottom and slit. He played with me for some minutes, titillating the interior of my vagina with his finger, pressing my thighs and tickling my bottom. In the meantime I had released his instrument from its place of confinement, and grasping it in my hand, I covered and uncovered its red head, and at the same time tickled his testicles. After a little time he drew me to the very edge of the seat, and, pointing his rod, entered my salacious slit. After a few pushes which sent a thrill of delight through me, he turned up all my clothes and regaled himself with the sight of his engine entering in and out of my coral sheath. I responsively moved my buttocks in answer to his thrusts, and in a few minutes we both discharged profusely. 4 times did he thus embrace me during our journey from Philadelphia to New York, and 4 times did I pour down my libation of love's dew. We parted the best of friends, and from that day to this I have never seen him, but the pleasure I enjoyed with him will never be effaced from my mind. Late the next day I called on Mr. Ralph Pittman, my father's lawyer. I found him to be a fine-looking man of about 36 years of age. He was nearly 6 feet high, and stout in proportion. He appeared to be very strong, and evidently enjoyed the most robust health. He received me very warmly, and I saw his fine eyes sparkle when he gazed on my womanly charms. My business with him was soon concluded, and it was decided that he should visit my late father's residence the ensuing week, for the purpose of finally settling up his affairs. I made up my mind that I would return home the next day, as the city with all its noise and confusion was not agreeable to my taste. The next morning I walked out on Broadway for the purpose of making a few purchases, when who should be the first person I met but Laura Castleton, my old teacher at B Seminary, and the first who initiated me in the delights of love. Laura was dressed in the height of fashion, and was as beautiful as ever. She recognized me immediately and kissed me affectionately. We immediately adjourned to Taylor's, where we could converse in private. I told her everything that had occurred to me since I had seen her, disguising nothing. Her eyes sparkled and her bottom heaved when I depicted all the love scenes I had gone through. "And now, dear Laura," said I, when I had finished, "tell me what you are doing now."
I am the mistress of the head Maison de Joie, New York.
"What?" I returned. "Do you mean to tell me that you keep a house of that kind?"
I do indeed, and a delightful time I have of it.
"How I should love to know its mysteries."
That you can easily do. Come and spend tonight with us. You shall see everything without being seen yourself. I have 24 magnificent girls living with me, and every one of them will be gloriously embraced tonight. You may depend upon it. The rooms are so arranged that we can see everything that transpires in them. Say you'll come."
My dear, I should love to. Only tell me where it is, and at what hour I should come.
"I live at number 637 Mercer Street, and come at 7 o'clock."
I will be there, you may depend on it. Soon after this we separated. I made my purchases, put off my departure until the next day, and at the appointed hour I was at Laura's door. My old friend met me at the entrance.
"You have just come in time,"
said she,
"for Horns Greenwood has just taken Olivia, one of the handsomest of my boarders, upstairs. She is from New Orleans, and one of the most lascivious girls I ever saw. I have no doubt we shall see some fun."
So saying, she led me upstairs, and ushered me into a closet which communicated with the adjoining room. Olivia and her friend were already there. I was struck with the beauty of the couple. The girl had intensely black hair and eyes, the latter of which were lighted up with desire and passion. Her bust, which her low-necked dress allowed to be seen, was really magnificent. Her companion was a fine, handsome young fellow of 22 or 23.
"Well, darling?"
said Horace, pressing her voluptuous bosom close to him.
"I have come to see you again. The thoughts of once more tasting the delights of your lovely person has kept me in a continued state of excitement all day. My staff is in a state of the fiercest erection."
"Let me have oracular demonstrations of the fact,"
said Olivia, opening his pantaloons in front. Out jumped his member, stiff and erect as a poker.
"Oh, you bad boy,"
she continued, taking it in her hand and rubbing it up and down.
"how gloriously still you are! I must kiss you then, you bad child."
So saying, she took his member in her mouth and rolled her tongue over it, at the same time tickling his testicles.
"Great God!"
he cried.
"This is too much. I shall spend, dear girl, if you do not cease. All my blood is in a flame."
"It is so delicious. I hate to give it up,"
she returned, giving it a last kiss.
"but I am excited as much as yourself. Slip your hand underneath my petticoats and feel how stiff my clitoris is."
He lifted up her skirts and took possession of Olivia's luscious con with his hand, and evidently found the little sentinel as stiff and firm as his own lance, for I saw by his motions that he was rubbing it between his fingers.
"How delightful,"
said Olivia, a shudder of delight running through her frame.
"It is too much. Stay, let me open my thighs a little wider. There, that is much better. Now you can manipulate my slit a great deal easier. What intense pleasure! Rub my clitoris harder and titillate the interior of my mount with your other finger."
"Yes, darling, I will, but your petticoats are in the way,"
replied Horace.
"I want to see my finger enter in and out of your luscious grotto."
"I will soon remedy that,"
she replied, lifting her petticoats above her navel, thus exposing her magnificent thighs, a portion of her white belly, and, above all, her delicious con.
"How beautifully you are made, dear Olivia,"
said Horace, devouring with his eyes the luscious sight before him.
"What a luscious belly, and then this masterpiece of nature, this splendid bushy mount. What words can I find to express its beauties? What fine silky down surrounds this luscious little con? How deliciously the lips pout, inviting a visitor! Let me examine the interior of this abode of happiness."
So saying, Horace seated himself on the ground between Olivia's thighs. With the fingers of one hand he opened the lips of her slit and peered curiously into the ruby cavity. He passed the other hand behind her, molding and pressing her buttocks, even advancing one finger into the narrow passage adjacent to the haven of love. After continuing this play for a minute or two, he inserted his tongue between the lips of her bijou, titillated the interior of her grotto, sucking her clitoris. Olivia was almost mad with pleasure, and showed it by opening her thighs to the widest extent. When she felt his tongue come in contact with her clitoris, she experienced the acme of delight.
"Stop, dear Horace,"
said Olivia, throwing her arms around his neck.
"or I shall indeed. Oh, darling, darling, For heaven's sake, stop!
It is a hard matter to leave the interior of your luscious grotto,
said Horace, withdrawing his tongue from her slit and looking into her face.
The sensitive folds of your vagina embrace my tongue so deliciously, and your clitoris is so beautiful that I hate to give it up. But, darling, let me see your beautiful boobies.
How fond you are of moulding and pressing a woman's breasts,
returned Olivia, unhooking her dress and shaking it off her shoulders, thus exposing her magnificently developed semi-globes.
Then here they are. Do what you like with them. See how stiff and firm the nipples stand out.
Horace then began to toy with her breasts, moulding and pressing them, and then sucking their rosy nipples. While he was thus engaged, Olivia took possession of his staff of love, capping and uncapping its large ruby head.
This is too beautiful,
said Horace, burying his head between her breasts.
I can contain myself no longer. Come, dearest, let us perform the last act of love. I must embrace you. You see how eager my member is to enter your delicious con.
I assure you, my slit is not less eager to receive it. Dear Horace, I burn for you. Come, my dear angel, come. Embrace me. Bury this delicious instrument into the deepest recesses of my vagina. Do not spare me. Push it in to the very hilt. Make your testicles knock against my bottom. Come, darling, into me, quick! See, I open the portals for you. There. Now you have a fair mark. Come, darling, come.
While she was thus speaking, she half reclined herself on the sofa and opened her thighs to the widest extent. He then divided the lips of her salacious con with a finger of each hand, and revealed the interior of that ruby grotto. Horace rushed between her thighs, and passing one arm around her neck, brought his instrument to the entrance of her slit. Olivia placed one of her feet on a table, standing close by the sofa, thus stretching her thighs as widely apart as possible. In another moment he was plunged to the very hilt in her body.
There, girl, you have it now,
said Horace, when his instrument was clasped by the lips of her coral sheath.
Oh, how deliciously warm your vagina is! Oh, how tightly your lovely con clasps my penis! And your delicious belly, how soft it is! Your charming boobies, too, how delightfully they beat against my chest! Stay, I must suck the nectar from those rosy lips once more.
He continued bending forward, and took one of the strawberry nipples in his mouth, at the same time continuing his energetic thrusts.
There! How heavenly! How delicious! How exquisite!
It is too much, darling,
returned Olivia, throwing her legs around his loins.
Closer, closer still. Look in the mirror and see how deliciously your penis fits my vagina. Stay, let me raise my thighs a little. You will see it better then. There, now you see it. How lusciously enters in and out of the coral cavity. Now I can see its ruby head. Now it is lost in the hair covering my mount.
His strokes quickened.
Oh, I can stand no more,
she continued, wiggling her buttocks.
Dear love, I come, oh.
I too am coming. There, dear Olivia, come.
During this scene their motions had increased rapidly, Horace giving violent thrusts, and Olivia meeting him with corresponding motions of her buttocks. As the climax approached, they seemed crazy with excitement, and at the moment of emission their legs and thighs mingled together in confusion. You may be sure that I was no passive inspector of this scene. During its continuance, Laura had taken possession of my mons veneris, and with her finger sought to give my excited feeling relief. At the moment of their discharge I too succumbed, and was so much overcome that I was compelled to sit down to catch my breath for a few minutes. When I had somewhat recovered, I again took my station at the post to enjoy commanding a view of the chamber. Horace was now stretched lengthwise on the sofa. He was perfectly naked, and Olivia was lying on the top of him, also stark naked. His arm was passed around her loins, and he pressed her tightly against his belly. His left hand rested on her shoulder. Her mouth was fixed to his, and her breasts rested on his chest. Her thighs were stretched widely apart, and Horace's staff was so deeply embedded in Olivia's slit that the very hair of their genitals intermingled. They evidently experienced intense pleasure. Olivia's buttocks were elevated high in the air, and she moved them energetically. Every time she raised her bottom, I could see Horace's lance entering in and out of the lips of her bushy mount, and sometimes I could even see the rosy head of his dart as he plunged it again and again into her coral slit. This motion became more rapid, and soon the lips of Olivia's glorious con seemed to contract and embrace Horace's staff closely. She then gave 2 or 3 convulsive struggles, and ended by falling without motion on Horace's belly. At the same moment I saw the sperm trickle down her thighs.
They have done for the night.
Whispered Laura to me.
Come with me, and I will show you something else. For I am very much mistaken if Rose has not a visitor by this time.
So saying, we left our place of concealment, and entered a similar apartment at the other end of the corridor. We entered a closet in this room, and peeped through some cracks in the boarding into the next apartment. I saw a very pretty little plump girl entirely naked on her hands and knees on the bed, presenting her delicious white buttocks with her lovely slit, shaded with brown hair between them. Behind her was a tall, fine-looking man, about 40 years of age, also naked. In his hand was a birch, with which he was gently tickling the lovely girl's bottom. "What does this mean?" I asked of Laura.
That girl you see there, Rose Monson?
She replied.
Nothing gives her so much pleasure as to be soundly whipped on the bottom by her lover. They always begin in this way. Her companion is George Coulson, a very rich gentleman. But watch them, and you will see something amusing.
I peeped again, and saw that George was using the rod a little more freely than when I had first looked. Already the cheeks of her buttocks were turned a rosy hue. His instrument was so stiff that it stood boldly up against his belly.
"Harder, George,"
murmured Rose, her face buried in the pillow.
"I scarcely feel it. Harder, my dear boy, flog me harder."
George obeyed her wishes and let fall a shower of cuts on her plump backside. He continued this for a minute or two, when suddenly throwing down the rod he rushed to her, and to my surprise, instead of entering her by the legitimate road, he entered her en coul, and, passing his hand in front of her, buried 2 of his fingers into her hairy mount. Every thrust of his buttocks sent his fingers deeper into her vagina, giving her intense delight. Suddenly I saw her put her hand between her own lily-white thighs and tickle his testicles. It immediately brought on an emission from both of them, and they sank exhausted on the bed. Laura now led me to another apartment, and again we took up our position. Here I saw a strong man standing in the middle of the room, holding in his arms a naked girl. Her arms were clasped around his neck, and her thighs around his hips. His instrument was buried to the very depth in her vagina. He had one hand clasped round her body, and the other supported her bottom. He moved her rapidly up and down. Every time he did so his staff entered in and out of her cavity, and in a few moments they both discharged. In the next chamber I saw a somewhat different scene. A beautiful girl, entirely naked, was seated on a low ottoman with her lovely thighs stretched widely apart. Her lover was kneeling on the floor before her, and was caressing her lovely con with his tongue. I was so placed that I could see his organ of speech enter in and out of her ruby sheath, the lips of which appeared to caress it lovingly. This act alone was sufficient to make him discharge copiously, at the same moment that his tongue made her dissolve in bliss. In another chamber, a couple appeared to relish giving themselves manual pleasure instead of the act itself. For a lovely girl reclined on the bed with nothing but her chemise on, but still having her breasts and the lower portion of her body bare. Her companion lay by her side. He had his fingers embedded in her slit, while she had hold of his instrument. They moved their hands together while he had hold of her bubbies, and tickled her bottom with his other hand. A few rapid motions caused the sperm to fly from his staff, and he drew his finger dripping from her vagina at the same moment. Another couple had chosen a strange way to satisfy their desires. The girl lay with her head on a pillow near the edge of the bed. The man was behind her, and had passed her thighs around the upper part of his chest, supporting her belly with his hand. They were closely joined together. He appeared to be able to enter a prodigious way into her by this mode, her bottom almost touching his face. While he embraced her, he bent his head forward and kissed her buttocks. They both soon emitted. I saw a great many other couples, but as they were for the most part a repetition of what I have already described, I shall omit referring to them. I thought I had seen all, when I suddenly heard a ring at the bell, and almost immediately afterwards I heard a gentleman's voice say something in French in the hall.
It is Alphonse de la Tour,
said Laura.
Now I shall have to show you something really worth seeing. He is the particular friend of Eudoxie, the most beautiful girl in my whole establishment, and more amorous and lascivious than all of them put together. She is lately from France, and does not speak a word of English. She is perfectly crazy when enjoying the sexual act, and acts in the most preposterous manner. Her naked body is worth going 100 miles to see. She is so gloriously beautiful. But come, let us get to her room first, for it is best not to miss the slightest preliminary of their love meeting.
I was very curious to see this paragon, and followed Laura to her chamber, which joined that of the French girl. We were soon installed in a convenient place of observation. We had been there but a few moments when Eudoxie, followed by her lover Alphonse, made her appearance. At the first glance I cast on the girl, I was struck perfectly dumb at her surpassing loveliness. She was about 19 years of age. Her face was perfectly oval, and her features as regular as if they belonged to a Grecian statue. Her complexion was a rich brown. Her hair was intensely black, and hung in 1,000 little ringlets on her magnificently formed neck and shoulders. Her eyes were shaded with long black eyelashes. Her teeth were beautifully white and regular. Her arms might have formed a model for a sculptor, while her bust, which her low-necked dress allowed to be seen, was the most beautiful I had ever beheld. Imagine 2 lovely globes of snow, which were so beautifully developed that they seemed to struggle to get free from the slight bonds that confined them. Every breath she drew caused those magnificent orbs to heave in sight. Her hips were fine, her figure magnificent, and her hands and feet excessively small. Her companion was a fine, handsome young man of about 30. He was well made, evidently of a very amorous disposition. The moment they entered the chamber, she ran up to her lover and, throwing herself in his arms, imprinted some hot kisses on his lips. I could even see her velvet organ of speech enter his mouth in search of his, and they remained for a moment glued together. Suddenly the amorous girl released one of her divine breasts from its bonds of confinement, and pushed it forward for him to kiss.
Baisez mon téton, mon cher Alphonse, je meurs pour vous,
said she, and she herself slipped the rosy nipple in his mouth. While he was thus engaged, she kissed his hair, his ears, and forehead.
Oh, foutez-moi, mon cher, mon con est en feu,
she exclaimed. And with that she began to tear off his clothes, and in a few moments he was quite naked. She then, with trembling fingers, began to disrobe herself, and every garment she took off only revealed new beauties. At last she stood with nothing on but her chemise.
Ôtez ma chemise, je suis si excitée que je ne le puis pas.
Alphonse slipped her sole remaining garment over her head, and she stood in all her naked beauty before us. I had seen many naked women, but none to compare to Eudoxie. She was grace, beauty, and voluptuousness combined. Her skin was dazzling white, her limbs models of beauty. Her tapering legs, her plump thighs, her white belly, her magnificent buttocks, and her mount of Venus were the most magnificent objects I had ever beheld. The moment she was naked, she knelt down before the object of her adoration, the position she assumed slightly opening the lips of her slit and giving me a glimpse of the coral interior, and, taking his instrument in her hands, She nestled it between her breasts, and bending her head forward, kissed it again and again. She then rose to her feet again, and making him lie with his back on the bed, she kissed his whole body. Now it was his staff, now it was his testicles, now she even caressed his buttocks. She placed one of his feet against her mount, and, dividing the lips with her fingers, forced his toe into her coral sheath, and moved herself rapidly up and down on it. This curious proceeding was very exciting to behold, and her lascivious caresses caused Alphonse's instrument to assume a prodigious state of erection. Now she got on the top of him, and, turning her bottom to his face, impaled herself on his staff. I saw its bulbous head distinctly separate the luscious lips of her slit, and then beheld it slowly disappear in her sensitive vagina. But she only kept it there for a minute, for jumping up again she placed it between the fleshy cushions of her buttocks, and holding it there with her hand, moved her bottom up and down. Then she suddenly turned around, and rubbed her white belly against it. Now she put it between her swelling thighs, now her armpit. In fact, there was no part of her body to which she did not conduct it. These manipulations were more than the young Frenchman could bear. He suddenly rose up, and pressing her palpitating body in his arm, he laid her on her back on the bed. She opened her lovely thighs to the widest extent, and revealed to him all the delights of the domain of Venus. How can I describe the spectacle that we saw from our hiding-place? An eminence shaded with a mass of hair as black as jet, the beauties of which the most delicate pencil could not trace. In a moment he was between her magnificent thighs. Eudoxie seized his member, and guided it into the delicious interior of her rosy con. It grasped his penis like a glove. Eudoxie was almost wild with excitement. She breathed short, and her bubbies rose and fell in the most delicious confusion. Their images were reflected in the mirrors surrounding the apartment. It was a glorious sight. There lay Eudoxie extended on the bed, her head reposing on the pillow, and her long hair streaming by the side of the bed. One of her legs rested on the ground, while the other was a little elevated, by this means extending her thighs to the widest capacity. Alphonse was between them, his staff buried in her con, with one of his hands moulding a globe of snow, while the other was passed round her body. How delicious the contact appeared to be! He suddenly leaned forward and imprinted 1,000 kisses on her lips. He then withdrew himself slowly from her, only, however, to plunge more deeply into the innermost recesses of her con. So delicious, so transporting, so celestial was the pleasure that they both felt, that Eudoxie threw her legs around his loins and pressed him closely to her, and they twisted and writhed in each other's arms. Eudoxie suddenly exclaimed,
Oh, ciel! Quel transport! Ah! Ah! Ah!
And finishing with a prolonged sigh, she poured down her tribute to the god of love, and then, with a few convulsive heaves of her divine bottom, she let go her hold and fainted away. He also emitted copiously and fell annihilated by her side. In a few moments they had both recovered. Eudoxie wiped Alphonse perfectly dry, and her lover performed the same office for her. Neither of them appeared to be satisfied, for I could see that the Frenchman's instrument was still in a state of fierce erection, and Eudoxie, by her touches and manipulations, proved that she was as amorous as ever. They now performed a strange action, which only shows how foolish young people can be when they sincerely love each other. Eudoxie went to a cupboard and took from it a bottle of champagne. She now placed herself on the edge of the bed in a half-reclined position. Alphonse sat on the floor, with his head underneath her thighs so that his mouth came in contact with her hairy mount. Eudoxie now uncorked the champagne, and, drinking a glass herself, she poured another glass on her belly in such a manner that it ran down to her slit, and from there into Alphonse's mouth. He swallowed it with the greatest gusto, and the operation was continued until the bottle was empty. This sight, strange as it was, inflamed me wonderfully. The parties were so beautiful, and every portion of their bodies so scrupulously clean, that all disgust was removed. The bottle was no sooner empty than they again proceeded to satisfy their amorous desires. Alphonse lay on the ground, resting his head on a low stool. She straddled his face so that her mons veneris came in contact with his mouth. As she stood exactly opposite our place of concealment, we could see his tongue enter in and out of her luscious sheath. While he was fetting her con, he advanced a finger into the narrow passage adjacent to the legitimate road, and kept time with his tongue and finger. Every time his tongue came in contact with her clitoris, a convulsive shudder ran through her, and her bottom moved responsively to his titillations. At last they both succumbed, he from the force of imagination, and she from the actual contact of his organ of speech on her excited clitoris. It was now quite late, and after Alphonse had departed, the house closed for the night. I bade my friend an affectionate farewell, and returned to my hotel. The next day I started for home. End of Volume 2, Chapter 3. The Life and Amours of Kate Percival, written by herself. Volume 2, Chapter 4. My Father's Lawyer. When I arrived home, I busied myself putting my father's papers in order, and was so absorbed by the occupation that not even an amorous thought entered my head. This took me a whole week, and I had only just finished when Mr. Ralph Pitman was announced. I received him very cordially, and treated him so freely that he soon felt quite at home. He had been there but 2 days, when we so far understood each other that he ventured to kiss me. I made no resistance. From his manner of kissing, I saw that he was of an excessively amorous temperament, and the fact that I had been 10 days without indulgence in sexual pleasure made me very desirous of tasting his capabilities in the school of Venus. The next day I entered the library rather suddenly, and found my friend deeply engaged in a book. When he saw me, he hastily endeavored to conceal the volume. "What are you reading, Mr. Pitman?" I asked.
"Something that I cannot show you, Miss Percival,"
he replied. "Nonsense," I returned. "You need not be afraid. I can look at anything."
"You will not be angry or offended if I show you this book?"
"Certainly not. I wish to see it, and rest assured that whatever it may contain will neither offend me nor shock me."
"Then take it, and judge for yourself,"
he answered after a moment's pause, at the same time giving me a burning kiss which sent a thrill through me. I opened the book, and found it to be one of a most lascivious character, filled with amorous pictures. I gloated over these engravings, and felt my blood all on fire. The engravings were from steel plates, and represented the famous 32 positions of Aretino. As they were extremely curious, I will give a short description of them to the reader. Their titles were in French, and consisted of as follows. First, La Patte Debout represented a man and woman standing face to face, with his instrument plunged deeply in her coral cavity. Second, La Grue, the same position but with one of the legs raised in the air. Third, La Porte de Devant represented a woman seated with a man standing between her thighs, her lustful crevice completely filled by his instrument, while her legs closely embraced his ribs. Fourth, Le Cheval Fondu represented a girl on her hands and knees, while a man was embracing her from behind, her head being reclined forward and her bottom elevated. Fifth, L'Allemande, the same position, with the addition that the man has his hands on her con. Sixth, La Brebis, the same position with the woman resting her hands on the ground. Seventh, Faire des Chandelles de Suif, the girl seated across the thighs of the man. 8, à l'arbre, the same position but with the girl's legs raised and with her feet placed against the man's buttocks. 9th, L'Enfant qui dort, the girl leaning against the man's stomach, her shoulders against his right arm, and her 2 legs resting on his right thigh. 10th, L'Entendu, the girl lying down on her back and the man standing between her thighs, embracing her in front, in which position he can see his instrument working in her con. 11th, Au dos pressé, a girl seated on a man's thighs with her legs wrapped around his loins. 12th, Cornuse, the same position, where a man rests one of the girl's thighs on his arm and presses the other down against his buttock. 13th, S'asseoir au col, the same position when he raises one leg in the air. 14th, Chausse-botte, a man taking the 2 lips of the girl's con and drawing them on his penis. 15th, Courir la bague, a man running towards a girl with thighs extended to receive him, and in this manner inserting his instrument into her con. 16th, à la pleine, the woman extended all her length on her back, with the man lying between her extended thighs. 17th, à la grenouille, the same position with the woman resting her feet on his heels. 18th, la Jeannette, the man lying all his length on the top of a woman. 19th, à l'Andronnette, when the girl stoops forward and the man embraces her in a standing posture from behind. 20th, au profil, a girl and her companion lying on their sides. 21st, à la botte badine, the man with one of his legs resting on the woman's flank. 22nd, derrière un con, a woman lying with her back to a man, with one of her legs raised in the air. 23rd, riche en fleuve, the man lying across a woman belly to belly. 24th, chevauché l'âne, the woman lying on the top of a man with his instrument in her con. 25th, à la galère, the same position with her side turned to the man. 26th, chevauché en baste, the woman lying across him. 27th, à la mauresque, the man seated on the bed with his legs open, the woman seated in the same position, but with her thighs resting on his. 28th, au clistère, the girl with her bottom brought to the edge of the bed, separating her buttocks with her hands, and the man standing behind, embedded in the trou de son cul. 29th, sonnet du cul, the woman seated on the edge of the bed with her feet resting against the wall, and during the act of coition she keeps raising one leg and lowering the other. 30th, les jambes au col à la revêche, the woman lying on her face with her legs resting on the man's shoulders. 31st, la cloche represented a man reclining on the ground, resting on his hands and feet, his belly uppermost, while the woman is seated in a basket without a bottom, so that her con comes through the open space to which was affixed a pulley, so that every time the rope was pulled it brought the woman's notch in contact with the man's penis, and the amorous combat is finished by continual pulling on the rope. 32nd, branler la pique, represented a man with his finger in a girl's con, and by his touches making her discharge, while she was doing the same thing for him. In this manner they enjoyed pleasure without conjunction, either standing, sitting, or lying. When I cast my eyes on the magnificent plates, the color mounted to my face, and I involuntarily pressed my thighs closer together.
Ah, Kate,
said Ralph, again kissing me and forcing his tongue into my mouth.
I perceive you are as fond of amorous sports as I am. I am delighted to make the discovery. I can foresee some delicious pleasures together.
And he pressed my palpitating bosom to his, kissing me in the same manner as before. Dear Ralph, I replied, returning his caresses by imitating his actions, and advancing my tongue to meet his. I have already been initiated in the mysteries of love, and have determined henceforth to devote my whole life to its enjoyments.
Bravely spoken, Kate,
returned Ralph.
But come, darling, take me into your bedchamber, and we will talk the matter over.
I led the way into my own private room. I had caused it to be neatly furnished, and it was replete with every luxury. A carpet soft as velvet was spread on the floor. Capacious sofas, soft and springy, just fitted for the performance of the conjugal act, were placed around the apartment. Immense mirrors adorned the walls, relieved by beautiful pictures. No light of day was permitted to enter this nest, but it was illuminated by means of brilliant gas-burners, and, to crown all, a perfume of the most intoxicating description was distilled through the atmosphere. When we entered this apartment, a delicious languor stole over me, and my amorous feelings were excited to an intense degree. I threw myself into Ralph's arms, squeezing, kissing, nay, even biting him. He returned my embraces with as much ardor as my own. I placed my hand outside his trousers and felt his stiff instrument.
Stop, darling,
said he.
These invidious clothes are in the way. I should love to feel your hand on my naked staff.
So saying, he began to undress, and in a few moments he was entirely naked. It was glorious to see his manly form in a state of nature. I rushed to him. I kissed his naked body all over. He shivered in my arms, and I really believe he would have discharged had he not torn himself from my embrace. As for myself, I was on fire. The contact of his firm flesh sent a thrill of joy through my system, and I had to exert the greatest control to prevent myself from pouring down the elixir of love.
Now, Kate,
said Ralph,
it is nothing but fair that you should let me see you naked.
dearest Ralph, do with me as you will. My whole body is yours.
Bless you, darling. I only hope I may be able to satisfy you to your heart's content.
So saying, he actually tore off my clothes and reduced me to a perfect state of nudity. He then led me to a sofa and reclined me upon it. I never saw a man so amorous and lascivious as he was. Sexual enjoyment appeared to be a perfect passion with him. When he had placed me on the sofa, he stood a few feet off that he might better observe my naked beauties.
Great God!
He exclaimed.
What glorious beauty! How magnificently formed your body is, dear Kate! What a delicious bust! What glorious semi-globes! How firm and hard! And then your belly, how white and smooth! What well-developed thighs! What straight legs! And above all, that masterpiece of nature, your delicious con. Open your thighs a little, dear Kate, that I may get a better view of it. There, that's it. Now I can see it perfectly. How inviting the lips look amidst that mass of black hair. How closely they fold together, showing a line of coral between them. Oh, how I long to taste the sweets of that delicious grotto. Now, dear Kate, turn on your belly, and elevate your buttocks a little. There, that's it exactly. Great heavens! The back of the picture is even more glorious than the front. What a delicious bottom! How closely the cheeks come together!
He now began to kiss what he had admired. He embraced my bubbies, my belly, my bottom, and the Mount of Venus. I could stand no more, but jumping up from the sofa I rushed into his arms, and exclaimed, "Dearest Ralph, give me relief, or I shall die!" He pressed me to him. My bubbies came in contact with his chest, our bellies met. The contact of the warm flesh almost drove us mad. We squirmed and wiggled in each other's arms. We hugged, kissed, and bit each other. We rolled on the floor, interlacing our thighs. His staff touched my con. The hair of our genitals intermingled. We rubbed our bubbies together. I rolled myself on the top of him, and moved myself backwards and forwards. He placed a hand on each cheek of my bottom, and pressed my hairy slit to his testicles. "Great heavens!" I exclaimed. "It is coming! Ralph, Ralph, I must spend! I must!
Dearest Kate, I too... There! Now it flows! Now! Now!
A convulsive shudder ran through both our frames. We closed our eyes in the ecstasy of our sensations, and both discharged profusely, the divine liquor running from one to the other. All this had been effected without any actual conjunction. A few minutes' repose followed, and we recovered our energies.
Kate, my darling,
said Ralph,
lie down on the sofa again. I want to manipulate your charms a little more at my ease. We were so carried away by our feelings that we discharged before we had sufficiently prolonged our pleasures. Let us be more prudent this time.
Acting upon this wish, I threw myself on the sofa, and Ralph seated himself on an ottoman by my side, and commenced to excite me by his caresses. Fastening himself on the first instance on my breasts, he sucked my nipples, patted and molded my bubbies, and tickled me under my arms. He was not satisfied with his tribute of admiration to my bust, but he straddled my chest, and brought his instrument and testicles directly over my 2 ivory globes. He then lowered his bottom, and rubbed his staff and pendants against soft cushions. Nay, more, he pressed my breasts closely together, and nestled his engine between them. Great heavens, how these delicious touchings excited me! Nor was he less moved, for his buttocks actually quivered with delight.
Kate,
said he,
how delicious your breasts feel to my pego. I could almost fancy it was its own proper nest.
And he commenced to move his buttocks backwards and forwards. For heaven's sake, stop, Ralph, or I shall spend. I shall indeed, I exclaimed. I can feel the crisis approaching.
So do I, darling, but it must not be yet.
He then dismounted, and took a seat by my side on the sofa, and began to play with my belly. He stroked it, rubbed it backwards and forwards with his hand, and tickled my navel. He then descended to my slit. There he made a full stop, and a convulsive thrill ran through his body when his hand came in contact with the bushy forest of dark auburn hair surrounding my mons veneris. He twined it in his fingers, gently pulling it, just to cause me the most pleasing titillation without giving me the slightest pain. He then invaded the sanctuary of love itself, and, gently dividing the lips of my bijou, cautiously advanced one finger into my vagina. After allowing it to rest there a few moments, he pushed it further in until it was wholly engulfed in my glowing passage.
"Oh, Kate!"
he exclaimed, moving his finger gently in and out of my slit.
"What a charming con you have! How tight it is! And only to think that I am to bury my staff in this lovely cavity."
"Darling," I replied, "your lascivious touches almost take away my senses." He withdrew his finger from my vagina and carried it to the top of my slit and tickled my clitoris.
"There now, I have the little sentinel between my fingers. Heavens, how soft it is!"
he said, rubbing it gently. During these manipulations on his part, I was not idle, but paid him back in his own coin. I stroked down his belly and rubbed his staff in my hand, making him squirm and wriggle again. Had anyone peeped in the door at that moment, they would have seen a delicious spectacle. Such an observer would see a naked girl and man seated together on a sofa. Our faces were close together. Ralph had one arm round my neck, his hand resting on my left shoulder. The other arm was pressed underneath my right thigh, which was elevated in the air, and the finger and thumb of that hand were buried in my con, the lips of which clasped them tightly. His left leg rested on the ground while the other was placed on the sofa, thus stretching his thighs widely apart. I was engaged in rubbing his stiff member up and down with my left hand, and intense pleasure was painted on our faces.
"It would be impossible to find such a pretty little slit as yours,"
said he.
"It is a veritable bijou. There now, my finger is wholly inserted."
He continued forcing his finger to the very hilt into my vagina, so much so that it actually touched the neck of my womb.
"How deliciously warm it feels, and it is so tight that when I withdraw I take with it the inner lips. Now, just fancy my finger a man's pego. Now it's in, now it's out. Now it's in, now it's out. Now—"
"For heaven's sake, stop! I don't want to spend just yet. It is too delicious," I exclaimed. He then made me get up from my recumbent posture, and placing me in a standing position, put one of my feet on a chair, while the other foot rested on the ground. By this attitude my thighs were stretched widely apart, and my con was fully exposed to view. He then seated himself again on the ottoman between my legs. His face by this means just reached my mount. He commenced to bury his visage in the hair surrounding my slit.
"Darling Kate,"
he said,
"I must now taste the delights of your delicious con. I have felt it, played with it, but I have not yet performed the act which is the most delicious of all to me."
"Do with me as you will," I replied. "I experience nothing but delight from your touchings."
"Push your belly a little forward. There, that's right. Now I have it exactly."
So saying, he deliberately separated the lips of my slit with his tongue, and worked it into the innermost recesses of my con. God, how delicious it felt! He then moved his tongue in and out, at the same time by scientific movement caressing my clitoris with his lips, giving me the most intense pleasure. I stood directly before a large mirror, and by looking into it, saw a most delectable sight. There I stood in my nudity, my naked body borrowing roseate hues from the artificial light, and seated between my thighs, his face also turned towards the mirror, was the naked form of the handsome Ralph. I could see his tongue enter in and out of my coral sheath, while my breast rose and fell with the delights of my sensations. I could tell when his lips came in contact with my clitoris, not only by my sensations, but by the tremor and writhings of his thighs. His legs were widely open, and I could see reflected in the glass his glorious engine in a state of princely erection. The motion of his tongue increased. "Darling Ralph, I'm going to spend. Harder, come, oh, come." I could hold out no longer, but with a convulsive heaving of my whole body, I emitted a profusion of the elixir vitae.
"Kate, dear Kate!"
exclaimed Ralph in an excited tone.
I must have relief. I am in flames.
I clasped him in my arms, and, pushing him to the sofa, I made him place himself on his hands and knees, by which position his buttocks were elevated high in the air. Great God, how magnificent he looked thus! His splendid buttocks shone in the gaslight. Between his thighs I could see his magnificent pego all surrounded with hair, and the two well-developed pendants. I patted his buttocks, I separated the cheeks, and titillated the division between them. My fingers came in contact with le trou de son cou. I cautiously penetrated it and tickled the narrow canal, and kissed his bottom over and over again. When I had wrought him up to the highest pitch of desire, I proceeded with further operations. Open your thighs a little wider, dearest Ralph, so that I may get my head between them. You have given me the most ecstatic pleasure, and I am determined to do the same for you.
Will that do?
He answered, opening them to the widest extent. Beautifully, I returned, fixing my head in such a manner that the insides of each of his thighs rested against my cheeks. I laid on my back, and was so placed that my mouth came in direct contact with his splendid staff. In a moment I had taken his engine entirely in my mouth. I titillated the end of it with my tongue, and forced the foreskin backwards with my lips. It was too delicious. I was ready to spend again.
Oh, how heavenly!
Exclaimed Ralph.
How beautiful, dear Kate. Titillate my anus.
I passed my hand behind him, and forced one of my fingers into the narrow way, moving it in and out, and keeping time with both my mouth and finger. I soon had the satisfaction of seeing the climax approach. He pressed his buttocks together. His muscles stiffened.
Now I am coming. Now. Oh! Oh! Oh!
He exclaimed, and with a cry of pleasure he emitted profusely. When we had rested some little time, I went to a recess and took from it a delicious cordial, of which we both partook freely. It had the effect of completely restoring our energies. We commenced our touchings and titillations, and were soon in a glorious state of desire again.
Kate,
said Ralph,
I am going to give you a glorious embracing, and if I don't make you spend as you have never spent before, I shall be very much deceived. I intend to treat your delicious little con to a delicate morsel. Now, Kate, on your back. Open your thighs, and let me engulf my staff in your salacious slit.
I laughed heartily and threw myself on my back. He was on the top of me in a moment, and in another second his pego was embedded in my con. It touched me to the quick, and I experienced intense pleasure. Ralph, while he was working his instrument in me, sucked my breasts and played with my belly, and just when I was about to spend, he placed his hand on the top of my slit and rubbed my clitoris. This finished the business, and with a cry of joy I again discharged, he at the same time pouring down his share of the nectar of Venus. This last bout appeared to arouse my amorous desires instead of quenching them, and I exclaimed in a frenzy, "Ralph, will you do a favor for me? You know that flagellation increases amorous pleasures. I want you to birch me on my bottom, while I make myself come with a dildo."
Get me a rod, dear Kate. I should like nothing better than to birch your naked buttocks.
I went to a cupboard and procured from it a birch and a dildo. The former I handed to him. I then placed myself on my hands and knees on the sofa, thus elevating my bottom in the air. I then brought the dildo to bear on my coral sheath. It entered the lips, and in another moment it was plunged to the very hilt into my vagina. He placed himself behind me, and began to lay the birch gently on my bottom. The skin turned a rosy hue, and I twisted and wriggled under this delectable excitement. I moved the dildo gently in and out of my con. "Harder! Flog my bottom harder!" I exclaimed. He obeyed by letting fall a shower of stripes on my buttocks. The motion of the dildo in and out of my coral slit grew faster. I wiggled my buttocks. I am coming. My bubbies trembled. I was now working for my very life. The instrument moved in and out of my lustful sheath so quickly that its motion was no longer perceptible. "Ralph, I spend, I die glorious, delicious, A convulsive shudder ran through my frame. The motion of my hand suddenly stopped. leaving the dildo still embedded in my con, and I fell flat on my belly without any sign of life. I was recalled to life again by the energetic thrusts of Ralph's instrument. Foreseeing my delirium, he could not restrain himself any longer, but felt that he must share it. Before we separated, we enjoyed each other several times more. The next day he returned to New York, and I saw him no more. I was now left entirely alone, but I was very busy, for the house was full of workmen embellishing the house and grounds. I have but a few more words to add. In due time all the improvements to the house were finished, and I began to feel very lonely. One winter's evening, just as I was about to retire to bed, I was startled by the ringing of the front door-bell, and almost immediately afterwards I was clasped in my cousin Harry Duval's arms. He had just returned from abroad. I shall draw a veil over the pleasures of that night, sufficient to say that Harry had become more dear to me than ever, and I paled before him in the art of giving sexual delight. The next week we were married, and since that time we have settled down into a quiet life. Neither Harry nor myself desire any change, and our existence has been fraught with every blessing. The confidence between us is so great that I have not hesitated to tell him my history. He has reposed the same confidence in me by telling me his, and some day I may perhaps give it to the reader. And now, dear reader, my task is done. I bid you an affectionate farewell. End of Volume 2, Chapter 4. End of The Life and Amours of the Beautiful, Gay, and Dashing Kate Percival, the Belle of the Delaware, written by herself.